see the Bigfoot here.
That's the name. And I immediately thought that we needed to invite him to Phenomenon. So we're really glad to have Robert. You know, he's known right now for Bigfoot, and he's been asked to speak about Bigfoot. He's been to other conferences to speak about Bigfoot. It's only a small percentage of what he does. You can bring up any subject you want with him. Maybe not marriage advice, but anything else, and he will have a really good, educated answer to give you. So everyone give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate that. First, I want to start with, I want to thank the organizers of Phenomenon. Even though they may not be in this room, I want to give them thanks anywhere for having me up here and give me this opportunity to share these information with you. Normally I have a pretty long out introduction, but today we're going to kind of keep it short. And would you get those lights when we wait?
Yep, that's right.
I don't mind if you guys can see me, because what's really important is you see what's on this screen today. So as a brief introduction, my name is Robert Kryder. I own a company called Kryder Exploration. I'm the CEO and project manager. The information I'll give you here today was gleaned mainly through university level studies, because we have worked on enigmatic subjects for years on the backside, being retained by professionals from the government, law enforcement, to working as advocates for private individuals. Most of that was under research and recovery of very enigmatic histories, technology, and other artifacts. During those studies, this led me into many areas and many places where other people will not frequent or don't. And this has also exposed us to other aspects of what could be and is out there. One of them is a giant hominin. Once we saw in 2010, I saw everything that was going around, mainly things like Bigfoot eating an ice cream cone and riding a quad. We decided, and I was on the tail end of a really bad treasure dig that was about $20 to $40 billion that went sour. So instead of having grievance over that, fighting the powers that be, I decided our teams will just put the effort into Bigfoot for a little while and see what we can do. Since then, we've managed to alter the way Bigfoot is studied, our private researchers and the professionals, and we've managed to change a 45-year pushed misconception that this is a big monkey. It's not a big monkey, this is a big human. And we're going to go over some of that today, but I just wanted to let you know the primary of everything we do isn't to become famous or stand on this stage. This is the most uncomfortable place I could possibly be. I have a lot of courage, and it takes more for some reason to amass even in front of a small crowd like this than it does to face off with one of these creatures. And other people don't seem to have that problem, but this is where I don't like to be. But I have to be here. I have to be here to share with you all exactly what we have discovered and found, and what they do to those findings, why you never actually get to hear about the good stuff. Now, I've got to keep this short because this is actually about a 2.5 to 3 hour presentation. We're going to knock this thing out in 90 minutes. Okay, let's just go ahead and get into it then. So the title you see here, Bigfoot, Ecology, Behavior, Scientific View, and Cover-Up. The study areas mainly are in New Mexico, but also our studies have ventured out all the way as far as Michigan, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. I want to start this presentation with a quote by Sir Conan Doyle. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be truth. Start with ecology. Diet and acquisition. So a lot of biologists take for granted when they do the calorie count for large animals that these things can't really exist, because where would they get their food? Where would they get the caloric intake and everything else, especially maybe midwinter? Greens are an important resource. Algae is something that has highly been looked over. When an animal doesn't have anything else to eat, we found that these creatures will consume algae and sand if that's all they have available. But algae and these greens are available year-round in many conditions. Even in very, very cold climates, you can often find intact algae below ice and things like that. So what they sustain on, or their substance, is a very important thing. And Russian olive, we have learned, is one of the most important in North America, especially since the species of tree has infiltrated most of the waterways all over the continent. This has provided them with conduits of travel, and constant food resource that never existed before. It's allowed them to venture into areas such as the desert regions of some parts of Arizona and New Mexico, where they may not have had an ability to do so. Russian olive is their primary food source in these regions. It can be collected year-round, and I do this as well. I often find the food sources they're consuming, and then I partake in those as well. Yucca being one of them. Extremely nutritious, and it offers you moisture when nothing else will. And in this case, what we've seen is where they have tore yucca from the root base, which even bear have a hard time doing that. And then they'll strip each and every leaf, and they'll bite off the bottom of the leaf. And in the right-hand photograph, what you see is actually the bite imprint of a Bigfoot. You'll notice that that scallop form is pretty large, and we'll show you more examples, but they tend to be about twice the size of a human. Treatment. So often, many animals treat themselves with their dietary supplements. So in this case, juniper berries, what they make gin from, are very astringent. They're very hard to eat, but what they do is they'll sanitize the mouth. And they'll also treat gastrinal dysfunction, or they'll treat stomach pains and things like that. So it's a high probability when you find this in their scat, that's what they're doing. Forage. Birds are an important part of their forage. And we call forage, people would think, well, that's picking berries and things like that. But to an animal like this, it doesn't require to hunt these creatures. They can simply collect them in the dark. Hummingbirds, as you see here, woodpeckers, as you see here, is a primary, and it's an easy food source to get. Once a woodpecker's at night, it's inside the hole, it can't get anywhere. If you know where it roosted, you can just pluck the side of the tree out, which they do. They put 2 fingers in the hole, pull the whole side of the tree out, get the bird. In this case, what we see is also indicative of behavior, which we'll get into later, but we see on the right-hand side, a pile of feathers that are neatly piled. This tells us an awful lot about the animal that's consuming these birds. It tells a lot about the intellect and how anal they are about certain things, like putting feathers in a pile. As well, if any other creature consumes a bird, they don't pile feathers. Nothing on earth does that. They pluck the birds first, and then there's never anything left. But it's indicative, again, of what we're dealing with, that it's not a common creature or a big monkey. Diversity. Now, this is something people wouldn't expect, and we talk about, again, what biologists would factor in as their caloric intake or their protein intake. In this case, it's a porcupine. They wouldn't commonly factor that because what in the world eats a porcupine? Porcupines are very, very effective. They're very, very effective at keeping predators off, and of course, because they're supplied with the quills. In the right-hand photo is a scat sample. You can see where the quills are actually in the scat sample. Not only did the subject eat a porcupine, quills and all, but they could pass those through the gut. Not a lot of creatures could pull that off. Primary food source, deer. Deer, what we find most often, if they're going to get protein, deer are the deal. Most deer are not scared in their habitat. We'll go into places where the deer will literally listen to you walk up within 20 feet of them, and when they see you're a human, they bolt. But what did they expect to come out of the brush? Because they hear the bipedal movement. They're well aware of what every animal sounds like. Something out there is bipedal that approaches them they are not scared of. In fact, we often see in these locations a lack of any other predators. There's nothing else preying on the deer. So either vicariously or intentionally, one way or another, they're protecting the herd. We've noticed that they don't flush them. They don't scare them. They funnel them into locations, and we'll get into that a little more, and they do things quietly as to not alert the herd. So their presence is never really seen as a threat. Alternative food source is livestock. And we see this only taken in certain areas and certain times, not as a common source. And we believe that also has to do with the intellect. I don't want to drag this home with me. If I create problems, I'm probably going to create problems for my family unit. That seems to be the case. I can't say it is, but it seems to be based on what we've seen. In the right-hand photo, you'll see a better evidence or picture of the scallop marks from the incisors of a Bigfoot as they scrape that cartilage and meat off the knuckles of the bone. What we never see in their feeding remnant is teeth marks from any form of canines or anything else. So if a coyote was to carry this bone around for very long, or even probably pick it up, it would leave teeth marks on the surface we could find. On all these feeding remnants, you never find any of that because they're literally stripping apparently either with their fingernails or fingers or whatever they're doing, but they're not biting except the knuckles of the bone. This is a method. So Grubbing is an acquisition that bears do in other forms where you tear open a log to get to the insides of it. But in this case, and in the cases we research, there's a lack of teeth marks or claw marks, and a bear cannot open up a log without leaving teeth and claw marks. Also, they'll open up the side or the bottom of a suspended log like this. In this case, we have the top opened, where it's been peeled open like a package and even placed next to the thing. So there's no other animal in the natural world who could like pick up that piece of wood and set it to the side. Method, tool use. You know, we think that people ask me all the time, they say, well, do they use tools? But I'll let you know, crows use tools. You know, a crow can be smarter than a lot of people. If you wanted to drink out of that bottle right there and you didn't have enough liquid and you had a little bitty short straw, how would you reach it? Well, a crow is aware they can drop rocks in there and displace that water and push that water to the top where they can get it. It takes a tremendous amount of reasoning for tool use. But we see tool use common in these individuals, and one of the things we see here is in the lower left-hand photo, you'll see a burrow. And in the bottom left of that pic, you'll see a stick. That's the stick they used to dig open this burrow. And how do we know that they did this and not an animal? In the right-hand picture, you can see that the marks from the digging are parallel, they're linear, and they're evenly spaced. That takes a thought process of knowing how much you need to relieve to get the most efficient dig process. Animals do not do that. Humans do this. This is something you won't find in any other tool use or any other type of creature, is that methodology of how the tool is applied to get the most efficient use. In this case, it was two subjects based on a feet print, and they apparently either moved a rabbit or other small mammal out of this burrow. Method for hunting, small rocks. As you see in this picture, there's tons of leaf debris, there's all kinds of forest debris, but there's nothing on the rock. The rock is actually sitting on top of all the forest debris. This is what happens when they hunt with rocks and they're distributing them within their environment. They'll use these to take out small game and even intimidate other animals or even researchers like myself, as we've been hit by a rock about that size before, and it doesn't feel good. Matter of fact, they could quite easily kill a person with a rock that size.
Is that this size?
That rock's about this, about a pound and a half. They also use large rocks as projectiles. In this case, we have about an 80-pound chunk of granite. This, we have the track from this individual is over on our table over there. It would measure 22 inches. And we also found a 16-inch handprint with this, where he had been carrying this rock around and two other subjects had been moving game downhill to his position. Now we know from other evidence that he's an older subject, he's thin, he's missing teeth, doesn't seem to be that mobile. So we believe that the other individuals are running deer down to his position. He's not chasing them. He was on all quad, on all fours, but only one hand down. The other hand was apparently holding this rock. Deer was walked down to his location, turned, and then the deer apparently was hit by the rock, knocked down. There was no more deer prints anyway, just his prints on from that point. So it's pretty easy to see through the inference of the evidence that there was cooperative hunting and this projectile was used to down a deer. Now at 15 feet away, an 80-pound rock is pretty well going to take out anything if you can throw it. Our second feature will be tracks. This is a favorite amongst a lot of people. A lot of people like to see tracks. And what we do is gather these to track the growth stages, to track the movement and things of the subjects. People say, well, did you cast all the tracks? Well, sometimes we find 200, 300 prints in a single trackway. Most of the time we don't cast anything. If it's a print of subjects we've already cast or that's not going to tell us anything, we just walk over it. So everything you'll be seeing here is part of a study, basically, not as a private collection. So we're going to start with what are tracks? What do you look for? Well, people always assume it's going to be a footprint, but these animals are not on their feet maybe 20% of the time when they need to get somewhere. The rest of the time they're on their hands, their knees, their elbows, sitting on their butt, walking the quad, moving around. It's hard to move through thick brush when you're a big animal unless you're down low. We look at the graph we look at the picture on the left, it looks like there's two divot marks there. And actually that's the heel, and then the mid-tarsal break forms a ridge, and then the forefoot, when you're doing this, can go down a slippery slope or gravelly slope without sliding. So they're letting their heel plant in and rolling over the front. That's a single print on the left-hand side at 22 inches long. On the right-hand side, we see a graph, and that graph is showing portions of the hand that are planted during different types of movement on the ground. Those are the most often found marks. Commonly, we'll see other We'll see witnesses say they vanished, or we'll see researchers that say I tracked them and the tracks just stopped, things like that. In almost every single case, we have been able to continue tracking the subject because we are looking for marks unlike anything anyone else would expect. Often fingertips and toes, which don't leave very much, and if you're not an experienced tracker, you're not going to recognize those as prints. On the bottom of that, you'll see they do the same action with their foot. Now there's a unique form, and I guess we'll go to the top of that right-hand graph there, and the top left you have kind of a paisley-looking form. And this is the most common, believe it or not, and what that is the side of a fist. And the reason you set the side of a fist down, not your palm, is because if you put it on something sharp or damage it, you can completely operate and do everything you do in the world if you damage that side of your hand. But if you damage the surface, the main surface of the palm, you're regulated. You're now hurt in your natural environment. You can no longer deal with your natural environment well. So they often are contacting the earth and in portions of their body that are not going to be damaged or affect them adversely later on. One that you've heard very popular anatomists, I would say, in reference to the Bigfoot enigma, say that if they tuck their toe, that's from wearing a shoe. No, it's not. If you've ever been out and go in the hills and stuff, you'll find yourself doing that too. And that's because we all know inherently and subconsciously, if we snag our pinky toe, we're screwed. And that's very what we see here. They'll even carry that pinky toe above the next toe over. So they only want to tell you because the toes are crimped together that that's somebody wearing a shoe. The same foot can be splayed in one print, cupped in the other, and they do that continually as they change the strata which they're walking upon. These are knuckle and fist marks. In the lower left-hand photo, there's two imprints there, you may see them. They're spread about 3.5 feet apart. The spread represents the minimum of the shoulder width of the subject. The two fist prints are 7.5 inches wide. We know who this subject is. This is the alpha female of this group. This is the group at GLST research area that I spent about 10 years in. Full gorillas in the mist. And it really was that type of action all the time. So we got to know which marks were being left by which ones. Now the fist on the right is from an unknown subject by Blue Lake, New Mexico. And what he was doing was hunting. And he's an average sized subject. And you can see one knuckle section. If you look at yours, you're gonna have about 1.25 inches, maybe a little more of a knuckle section. In this case, those knuckles are 2.5 to 3 inches long. Well over twice the size of an average human, and this is not a full-grown adult. And he took out a young elk at this site, which the deposition of dirt and other debris from the fight was over a 25 to 30 foot square or circle area. You could find dust and dirt because the battle for that young elk had been so horrendous. 2 elk approached, 1 elk walked away. This is a handprint from the large individual in the Sandias. Now, these were all also taken as part of the Oxford-Lausanne study. So we worked with Oxford University and the Museum of Lausanne, Switzerland, to do, Museum of Zoology, Lausanne, to do data collection and DNA collection for them. And these were part of the stuff that came in with this. So that's a 16-inch handprint. My entire hand fits within the palm of that hand, just in the palm section. That's how big that subject is. Another odd marking, with any animal in natural order, any creature, human, hominid, whatever you're going to have, it's not just going to have feet print, handprints, and things. You're going to have marks from the young, marks from the family, and they're going to be all types of activities. In this case, it appears to be play. What we see here is a sandbar on a very gravel, hard-packed riverbed where the bar was nice and soft, and the younger subject got in there on his hands and knees and was scooting himself across the sand. At one point, as you can see in the right-hand photo, there's no continuance to the marks, they just stop. What we're seeing there is when a large subject picked that young subject up, probably for leaving marks in the sand. We see it repetitively. When the young ones start making marks, a big one will come and snatch them. Apparently because marks are a no-no. Any animal in natural order also has to breed, and they're going to have young. And these are the marks of an infant. On the right-hand photo, that's a 4.25 inch mark. Now we knew when they had this offspring, because we were finding the fecal material was blue and green from the female lactating and the young infant feeding. So we knew we had an infant in, but it was a few months before we ever found a spot where she set that infant down. In the first place we found she set the infant down, it already had a 4.25 inch foot. On the left-hand photo, those are actually a little larger because they're just a couple of months later. The growth rate is very fast in these first 6-7 months, very, very quick. much quicker than a standard human. And you might notice in these follow-up photos, pay attention to the size of the great toe and the great toe structure, which is called the first metatarsal. They're greatly exaggerated in these animals at a very young age. And as you can see here, if you've ever seen a human child with a foot like that, look at the width of the foot. Look at the symmetry and how triangular it is and how even. You notice it doesn't have a canter or it doesn't have an angle like a human does. Not only that, the great toe structure is about 4 times larger than a young adult human, a modern human would be. In many cases, we see this represent almost half of the length of the foot. That's a tremendous ratio. And the toe size is so big for a young individual, we have to ask ourselves why. The reason is because they're about to attain a weight and a stature that far exceeds ours very quickly. That structure needs to be there because this is going to be holding the weight and growth of an animal. Also, the amount they travel is far different than a modern human. This structure is formed for them specifically and the way that they live. Even though their feet may look a lot like ours, when they get larger, you can see here from the child's feet print that they are not like ours. Another subject, juvenile, 8 inches long. This trackway has been argued about a million times by people because they swear that one print in the trackway would be human and the other print in the trackway would be a Bigfoot. And it's interesting because I've seen this argument go a million times, and even by the best PhD out there made that discernment. But they didn't realize is I took the picture of the same trackway, it was the same subject, and the picture of the feet were about 30 feet apart, a different substrate. But they swear one print was human and the other was Bigfoot, and there's no, based on all these defining factors, not realizing it was the same subject in the same trackway. This is a juvenile at 9 inches. This one's on the table we have out there. And this one shows you a very unique form. On the right-hand photo, you see, if you look really closely, it's kind of hard to tell. There's actually a circular feature in the middle of the foot, kind of toward the outside a little bit. That dermal pattern isn't possible in a modern human because we don't have a bone structure that'll contact the earth there. But one of our recent conferences we presented at, there was a biologist who was a specialist in anatomy, and he told me point and saying, if they have a hinge in the middle of their foot, there is a bone there, which ours cannot touch the ground without smashing and breaking all the bones in your feet. But with theirs, that bone would protrude down and leave that exact dermal pattern and callus feature that we see there. Another point indicative of something that's not modern human. Here we have a track at what we call adolescent stage, about 10 inches long. Track of a young adult. We suppose this would be female. Most of the feet we've seen that were associated with what we call female activity are slender and they're slightly curved. They're quite a bit different than the male print. Here we get a little bit bigger. This is a transient male that has left the group, and we were tracking him on a mountain about 4 or 5 miles away from the main group. He goes in and out quite frequently. He's one of our best tells about what they do when they're not in the family unit. Apparently he has gone off on his own. He's living on a little mountain up there, and he comes into the family unit every couple of weeks, sometimes more often. What you can see here is a 17-inch footprint in snow that we were able to get off of him. And in the lower, the left photo, you'll see the 17-inch print, and then that's my boot print below it. You can just kind of get a glimpse of how big they are in compared to us, and this is not an adult. Or a young adult. We don't consider him full grown whatsoever. And you can see the right-hand photo where that trackway was actually following a rabbit before we had encountered it. This is larger. This is when we begin to scale out. So these are tracks from the alpha female of the group, the same as I showed you from the fist prints. So her foot is 20 inches long. It's 8 inches wide. It's just a hair wider than her fist. And this is, on the left-hand photo is again a picture of the print, which looks like 2 large divots with my boot print above it. Actually, that's look at my boot print, the form, heel to the front plant, look at the form below it, heel to the front plant. We have exactly the same form of a step, except it's 20 inches long. On the right side, what we see is where she has descended a slope. Now, I can walk down this slope without breaking out the ground. Matter of fact, I don't break out the ground. You can make it push a little bit, but you certainly can't do this. What we see here is 20-inch prints indicative of a tremendous amount of weight, easily over 1,000 pounds. I would guess she's probably 1,600 to 1,800. These prints took us many years to get. Even though we tracked the large male with audio many, many times, and we would be able to go in and find sign of the family unit, we would never find his sign. At this point in the lower left-hand photo, what you see is where he took a few steps across a frozen river. Now the ground in this case was so frozen he never left a mark. But what he did crossing this was punch holes through ice that was about 3 to 4 inches thick. Deer could hop across it, whatever, no problem. I can walk across, I can jump on it, no problem. He was punching holes right through it. The stick you see if you can see it in that lower left photo, is a 7-foot step. You'll notice it doesn't even fit the gap. That step was an 8-foot step. It takes an awful big animal to do that. Each step in this case was 8 feet until the last one, which is 12 feet out onto the bank. On the right-hand photo, you see a 23-inch print. This was after over 10 years in there with the family unit. Now we had gone in with another guy and he had seen the prints right next to me because they were so big. My brain was making them out, and I'm a tracker. And my brain was parting them out into other forms. But from 40 feet away, he looked and said, "My God, Rob, you're standing on a print." We backed off, measured everything, looked at it, and it sure enough, it was the track weight of the large male for the very first time we'd ever seen it. So I went in the following day. By myself. Well, I wasn't even by myself initially. A guy went with me. After 45 minutes, don't know why, he wanted to leave. So I let him leave. I laid in there and let the rings in the water settle a little bit, and I went walking about on myself, and I got to a stealthy point. Just had an idea, kind of approached a little dirt hill. When I crested it, I flushed the big one, 57 feet from me, broad daylight. That led to this print. That encounter is on our YouTube channel. You guys are welcome to go see it. It's called Waking the Giant. But if you go look at it, look for part 2 that has the follow-up research behind it. I took this photograph with the subject 40 feet from me, breaking branches and breaking things. One of the most difficult encounters I've ever had been there because my legs literally wanted to run. I had to look and see if I was pissing myself. I'm not even kidding. It was that damn scary. I tried like hell to crawl in there and get my camera on him. Every time I did, him or another subject was meeting me at a pinch point. Animals don't do that unless they're going to snatch you. So I could not, no matter what I tried to do, I could not force myself to get in there that deep with him because he was coming to meet me every single time. Extremely hair-raising experience, and after an hour and 45 minutes, he finally gave out a couple of grunts and let me know it was absolutely time to leave, which I did.
Can I ask what state that was?
New Mexico. We're going to go into another section. This is foliage manipulation. Often, if you guys are Bigfoot enthusiasts or interested in the subject matter, you've seen structures put forward to you before. Very few times is there any explanation behind the meaning of these structures. And in this case, it's not a lot different. We have some indication of what they're doing with them, but not a lot. When we look on the lower left-hand photo, we know from study and replication that this is how they mark an area they are currently occupying. They will take new growth, especially Russian olive hardwoods, and they'll snap the new growth branches. And they'll do this daily while they're in there. And they'll do this at entry points into thick zones. So you can actually, we work along the riverbed, I look for these breaks, I track how fresh they are. When I find them from that morning, I know the group's within a couple 100 feet of me in that area. So we actively use these to find the group, and we believe that's what they're doing for other subjects. They're leaving these marks because the other subjects they're away from, the transient individuals can then come find the family unit without hollering out, screaming. They basically track them into position. On the right-hand side, we see another form of marking we call flags, where they'll take a sinuous or fibrous tree, like a cedar in this case, and they'll twist the absolute shit out of it. What it does, it shows a large foliage flag that you can see from a great distance. At this location, particularly, there was tons of damage and a lot of foot traffic that appeared as if this was the family unit or the kids were hanging out. And something you want to notice is on the top of the right-hand photo there, something very, very unusual. Do you see what that looks like? That's right. It's a blue and white basketball. It's not dirty. It's not deflated. It's not been there very long. But why is it here? This is not any location whatsoever where a child would go carrying a ball or anything else. This isn't like that. This is somewhere where they live, they occupy, and they do what they're doing. All we can assume by seeing this is one of the transient subjects got a basketball and brought it home to the kids. This is a rub and scent post, and you're probably not going to see any other research group or anybody show you any of this stuff. But what we've been able to find throughout the research are the way they mark entry and corridors into the river systems. So you'll have different valleys, or you'll have side canyons and arroyos that they use for travel networks. And wherever these enter a large foliage system, they'll have these posts set up. I didn't find one for 10 years. But once we were able to figure out how they were doing this, we found up to 4 of them in a single day. And you'll notice in that right-hand picture there, if you can see it good enough, there's a bunch of chestnut hair stuck in that. What they're using these for is literally rubbing posts. So if we're going to look for DNA collection and things like that, we don't have to search far. They're distributing this stuff all over the place. They're doing it in purpose so that other subjects of this family unit can identify the region that they're going to occupy. It shows them how to enter the river system. Year after year, they will use these same posts. We've seen hair in them. One clump of hair lasts for over 5 years. You could still go back and collect hair from the same rubbing. But what we're really looking for is the redeposition of hairs. And in this case, this is the first time we've seen the chestnut color, which would be coming from one of the young males. Normally it was the adult female who was doing all the rubbing, but now we see one we call George, with about a 14, 15-inch foot at this time, has begun taking over the rubbing, has begun rubbing his material into these rubbing scent posts. Barriers. So barriers and blinds are very interesting, and they're also indicative of the size of the animals who are doing them. And in this case, we were up in a region we call the Lodge Kill Zone. On this particular trail, up to 30 people have gone missing in a single year. That's not hyperbole, as one of the people on my crew is active USFS Forest Manager out of Maricopa County in Arizona. He's now in Oklahoma. But he's a 19-year officer in the Forest Service Department. He was there when these were collected. He verified for me within their own records that up to 37 people in 3 years have vanished. There's no investigation on any of this, and most of them are not reported. No one goes into these spots. What we see here in these photographs are indicative of animals that are so big it's hard to fathom. In the lower left-hand photo, you see a big dead tree laying there. That tree is 110 foot. It was placed there with all the branches and pine needles and everything on it, fully green and alive. And I say placed there because in the right-hand photo, you see a large root ball, but you don't see a hole. But you see dirt that fell off the root ball a few feet from it when it was being carried in. Now that tree's gonna weigh a little over 18,500 pounds if you cut the root ball off. Add another 1,000 pounds for that root ball. You're basically talking about a creature who could carry in a 20,000 pound tree with all the branches on it and lay it down. Now once you look at the tree in the foreground, real up front there as well, there's no hole there. Now draw your attention far behind that big root ball. Do you see the other one in the distance? There's no hole for that one either. Matter of fact, every tree you can see laying horizontally on the ground in that photograph was carried in and has no hole. Look at how much they will do. All this was just done to funnel deer. So when we talk about what they do, the effort and all these other things, we have to consider what's doing it and why, and also how important was it to do. So apparently carrying an 18,000 pound tree was no big deal because they're just using them like just Lincoln logs out there just to move things around, keep them where they want to go. Go ahead.
More than one creature carried out.
Yeah, I believe that this is a cooperative effort. And in these, I will get to it in a minute, but in higher regions, it appears that we don't have much family activity or even smaller subjects. Anything under 16, 17 inches isn't up there. By that, we would think that it's a group of the large males that get together. I'll go over that a little bit in a minute. So territory and prowess. So this situation is where they will put up markers to basically indicate, here's how badass we are. Here's how big we are. You really want to go in here? On the left-hand photo is something you may never have seen. Now, a lot of us have seen where they pull trees in the Pacific Northwest or in Alaska and such and stuffed them in the ground, even in Michigan, stuffed them in the ground upside down. And we're amazed by that. We don't know how they do that. That takes, the type of pressure and weight it takes is incredible. You can't even fathom it. But in this case, we see another type of evidence, the same type of power, a little bit more subtle. That's a 30-foot, on the lower left photo, that's a 30-foot pine tree that was pulled out of the ground like a carrot, straight up, did not break the taproot. And I've asked everyone for years now, have you ever seen a pine tree out of the ground with the taproot on it? You generally won't. Because you can run a bus into that tree and it won't take the tree out. Not if that taproot's intact. It'll fold the vehicle around the tree. The ability to tear that root straight up like that, I don't even know it could do it. A backhoe wouldn't be able to pull it out. And it also has a curve where it was growing around an obstruction like a rock or something, which would have made the extraction even that more difficult. What we see is this tree had all the limbs and green needles on it when it was placed. On the right-hand photo, we have generally we determine as, based on the evidence, as a territory marker. You're good until you cross this point. Don't go beyond this. In this case, the tree on the left is over 90 feet tall. Be about a 4,000 pound tree because it's a thin one. On the right, it's about 80 foot tall, maybe 3,000, 3,200. But you can see what they'll do just to mark a territorial marker. You're going to carry up, stack 7,000 pounds between two trees and position them so they're good. That shows quite the ability, and also is indicative of what you're about to run into if you pass these things.
In that picture,
Yes, sir.
on the right-hand side, there's a round. It doesn't look like it quite belongs. Is that anything, or am I just about center?
Yeah, so there's an apple there.
Oh, it's an apple.
Yeah, and that apple is about 80 feet in front of the X. So for scale, it looks like it's next to the X, and the X doesn't look too big, but it's actually about 80 feet in front of that X. So yeah, that's an apple placed by one of our researchers. Kind of a gift. Tell them don't mess us up. So yeah, that's a scary place to be, so you might as well, right? So defecation. Defecation is something that's probably the biggest tell to the species. We can get more information by their scat than anything else, but it's also one of the hardest things to get. Some of the best researchers in the world have never found scat. But again, like anything else, like the rubbing posts, once you understand their behavior, you can predict where these things are going to be. We found up to 48 piles in a single day, which apparently represented about 5 to 7 days of activity within that area. As you see here, we have placement. Placement's going to be how they go. Often, or what we normally see, unless it's a transient subject, is where the entire group goes and defecates together. Nice little family activity. Generally, they'll have one subject off away from the rest that'll either go after, before, or whatever, but you usually have all the family goes in a small area, 3, 4, 5 feet apart, and then about 20, 30 feet away, you'll find one more pile. And what we assume is happening here is you have a sentinel. You have someone who's not going with them, watching what's going on. When they get all done, he goes. Then they all move along. Most often, you'll find these defecation spots within active river systems or behind tree and foliage and things like that up against a major obstruction where they cannot be approached from the other direction. And knowing this, we've been able to, of course, go in behind the family unit and see what they're doing, where they're going. On the right-hand photo, you also notice that we don't just gather scat piles without any information behind them. In the lower of that photo, you can see a stick or tape on the ground. You'll notice 2 large patterned marks. Those are the feet print from the large female. Those are the 20 inch prints, and they've got about a 4.5 foot step gap. And if you ever wanted to step in the hall and try to make a 4.5 foot step gap, it's pretty tough. A person's not going to pull that off. But what we're seeing in that photo is that we have a lot of other evidence of their presence along with the scat. I call this Bigfoot GPS. Because interpretation is the biggest point. In this case, it's going to tell us not only what they've been eating and things, it tells us where they go. Now, on the left-hand photo, we find juniper berries. We can assume that the subject has gone to juniper to eat those berries to probably treat some form of gastric ailment or whatever. But on the right-hand photo, we see a lot more. If we look closely, we start at the top, we have a grasshopper leg. Then we have deer fur, a rodent bone, pinyon pine nut, Russian olive seed. The unique factor about this is this gives us enough information to tell us how far this subject traveled within one feeding period. In other words, the feeding period within a few hours that would result in a single defecation. Here we see that he's eaten both pinyon pine nut and Russian olive. These 2 species in this location, the closest they grow together is 5 miles. The pinyon pine up on a mountain. The Russian olive, of course, down in the bottom. So that we know this subject traveled from the bottoms to that mountain, and then back to the bottoms again where he deposited the scat. On the way, we can see it collected insects, a little deer somewhere, and these other things, but it gives us an idea of the daily activity. And sometimes we even find things like bird seed from feeders, from ranches and things, and we were able a couple times to decipher who was putting that specific kind of feed out, so we knew where this subject went to get that feed. Generally, this is the 17-inch foot guy who comes in and out quite a bit of the group. And often his scat contains all of these things because he's going back and forth to his mountain. Vocalizations. This is also a favorite amongst many. Now we have some very unique vocalizations to play today, and most of my conferences, they have not worked out too well. A couple are going to be very, very low tones that we had hoped we'd have some large PA speakers, because seldom have people ever had the opportunity to hear what the lower tone vocals sound like. Better yet, what they feel like. We often hear that the infrasound is something that's attributed to the abilities of this animal, and it's true. I've been infrapounded, I would say, which felt like being hit by about an 8-foot roll of carpet, swung by a big guy, and hitting you as hard as you could be hit in the ribs with that. That's what it felt like. The audible part I didn't feel, but it was and the part that wasn't very audible was that second and that hurt me. I threw up for and vomited for 2 solid days after that, and I could not get my head square. During this, we're going to try to expose you to a little bit of that feeling, but there won't be any damaging frequencies. But let's hope not anyway. But so we're going to start off with a pretty unique vocal, and this is a male Bigfoot sounding to the family. But during this episode, a mountain lion responds to his calls. Let me get it to cooperate here. Okay, there we go. I'm going to comment real quick. When you hear that, whoa, 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 that's when he's turning his head back and forth. And when he gets to where he's facing our parabolic, you hear the amplitude jump tremendously.
Is that where he usually records the parabolic?
Yeah, this wasn't the KXPD3s that we built. This was actually done with a 36-inch tone-built parabolic, 22 feet off our laboratory. And so we would track them from a couple miles and track their movement back and forth using that system. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next one. Now I'm going to skip
What
around.
is he trying to do? He's calling them?
Well, he's coming in and he's locating the family unit, and in the very beginning of that, you actually hear a grunt, and that grunt would be probably from the alpha female or one of the other individuals within the family unit
And he's calling
reacting.
them on
Yeah, basically, he's coming into them. You know, he's coming in from long range. We track him. He howls. They make a sound. He figures out where they're out of the river system. Yeah, it does happen. Yeah, and we'll do some question and answers when we get over. Make sure we can get all this squeezed in here. This is a howl whoop. Now, what you also heard during that, was a second subject that kind of harmonizes with him or makes that sound. We got a little more of that, so no problem. We're going to this other howl. Now, this was isolated. So in sound booth, you can basically circle the audio that you want and eliminates everything else. This is what happens when we do that. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, that they'll harmonize. This is the male calling in and a few of the family subjects answering back in harmony. How cool is that? I mean, it's just about singing, right? So let's check out that. Let's check out another one. Same group, different day. Okay, so what you can't tell there is there's actually 6 subjects in that are all matching howl. You can barely hear them come in and out, but on a spectrum analyzer you can see each one of them separately. I'm going to go, the bottom howl sequence is kind of long. If we have time at the end, you guys can check it out, but it's like 3.5 minutes, so we're going to save that. Ooh, what just happened? Okay, so this, I'm sorry you guys have to bear with me. This laptop is a little bit temperamental, so. Okay, let's see if we can get up here now. Oh, there we go again. Yeah, and sorry, that's not me. That's our good old laptop there. Okay, let's see if we can make this one work. So we're going to go ahead and go to, let's do this. Let's see what the vocal capability is. And you've heard a lot of human singers and things like that, and how long they can sustain a note. Tell me if this sounds right to you. Now, can you imagine the lungs it takes to produce a high amplitude howl for that long? I don't know of any other creature on the planet that can pull that off. Now, when they get a little upset, they tend to sound a little bit different, and this is more like what they sound like. Now, again, that was highly filtered. That was recorded probably 4 or 5 miles, and we had to filter it within the sound program to be able to bring it out clear for you. But you can kind of hear the veracity and the aggression behind that.
Is that one?
Yeah, that's just one subject. Now, I'm going to play the stuff that we get to hear in the field that people, I don't know if anyone's ever got to listen to a recording like this, but I'm going to let you know now. You're going to hear about 20% of the audio that's in this, because this speaker system will not produce the tones that makes up the good 70 or 80% of this. You probably will feel it a little, but I'll let you know in real life, you can't breathe when this is going on. It rocks your body so hard, none of your muscles can work. I got another one here. So when they say, can they, here we go again. When they say, can they go and do an infrasound? Absolutely. And if the speakers could produce those sounds, I couldn't play it for you because it could tear you up. Here's another one. So you can hear how the building reacts to that. You can only imagine if we had a big subwoofer what that would feel like. It'll move the chairs over around. Now, can you imagine being out there in the dark by yourself and having something literally move your body around? That's what we're dealing with when we get to these guys. So we're going to go ahead and go out of vocalizations. We're going to go through our steps of our research and basically some of the results we've had in a kind of a quick format. So foraging. They'll move as a scattered group, searching for individual and group food resources. Gathering and consuming foods while searching without collections. They'll often just pick and choose as they go. Collecting and delivering food to sedentary individuals at camp. Now, this isn't the only species that'll do this by far, but it is usually indicative of hominins, or at least the higher primates, that if you have a subject at home who can't get around, do we gather up food and bring it back to them? And we see this behavior consistent at these. Using top methods of plant animal hatch and migration times and stages. And we've seen this too. We've seen it evidence in gypsy moths, or the large moth grubs. They all seem to know what mountain face hatches out at what time, and at what time that they produce the moths. And they'll hit those slopes when they're most productive. And they'll often pick up rocks weigh 1,000 pounds and move them just to get these grubs. What we do see is what we would normally indicate teaching, to where you're teaching the youngers, or at least they're experiencing this repetition to understand when these hatchings are going to occur and on what mountain slope that they do that. They'll also search as an individual subject. So we see transient subjects that will search for food on their own to feed themselves, whether it be hunting or whether it be gathering techniques. And then it takes us into hunting. They'll use cooperative hunting techniques for small and large game. They'll funnel and direct deer into ambush positions by use of foliage barriers, similar to what I showed you earlier, but often they're just small trees laid across slopes and angles or something to slowly drive deer down. Deer don't like to cross over things if they don't really have to. So if a tree's laying there, they'll walk along it rather than step over it. And that's kind of the behavior they depend on. So they'll lay trees down and create a giant funnel into perhaps an erosion zone or an arroyo or a river system where they can set up an ambush point. Funnel and direct deer activity with presence of vocal reports. They do this to people. So when people say, yeah, it was paralleling me in the trees and it kept making clicking sounds or whistling noises or throwing little rocks or whatever it is, the vocal reports from these creatures direct us out of the forest often. And they do the same thing to the animals. Those make small vocal reports not to alert them, but to drive them towards specific locations. Construct, utilize sound traps to locate both prey and make them aware of danger. So a sound trap is where you would have a trail system and you would lay maybe 8-foot-long sections of branches, you lay them in line with the trail, then you literally cross them over perpendicular with a bunch, and then you'll lay some more, and then you'll fill that with leaves. What this is, it does a couple of things. One, it enables them to be just laid up in the shade and laying around sleep, and when a deer or any other animal goes walking through there, they step in that section, they know they're there. As well, it allows them to go into areas, block all the other entries, put a sound trap on the entry point, and when teams like myself go in there and research them, we're screwed. We can't make it over that without making noise. We can't clear the 8 foot, especially if we're in packs or gear or anything else. We can't clear the 8 foot to stop from making the noise. They win. They're often gone. Once you touch that, they're gone out the backside. You might get a single vocal report or movement, but that's it. So these things are extremely effective. It also shows to the intellect and planning of those species. They build rodent small game traps fashioned as nesting sites. So we've seen where they'll have a clear area with a hard packed ground. They'll take a stump that is either natural or been cut or whatever, and they'll set it in the middle of the clear area, and they'll pack a bunch of dry grass and stuff underneath the stump. Sometimes these will be up, sometimes they'll be over. And what's interesting is it appears as that they're creating traps. They're creating zones that rodents and things will go and nest in, and they can just move the stump and grab them. But it's obviously a placed setting to do this with a lot of pre-thought and planning. Occupation. They'll utilize an area about 2 square miles for 5 to 7 day period as a family group. They utilize an overall range of approximately 100 square miles as a family group. They'll change areas as impact grows and resources diminish to non-adjacent areas. In other words, they don't just move next door when they move. They'll occupy a zone until they affect that zone to a certain degree. Then they will move and not move next door, but maybe a mile or 2 down. And that's obviously because the game that they've already flushed, the impact they've already had, will affect the region right next to it. So in this way that they're always having basically a fresh zone to occupy. They're not having too much impact on it, and they're not aware of making the game too aware of flushing anything out. Alter overall range due to seasonal weather and or game migration. So when people say, well, where do they go? Are they transient? Are they not? Well, it's all the above, and a lot of it has to do with the resources and the environment which you're in. And we, of course, see that where they follow snowline migration, or they follow animal behavior and animal migrations. Utilize high rugged areas as retreats for solitary and group large males. Again, lodge kill zone area, where all the people vanish. It seems to be is the only thing we find evidence up there is the big males. That's it. They know a lot of Native American tribes do the very same thing. The elder guys don't want to hang out with all the women and children, so they build lodges and retreats and go up in the mountains and they hang out together. This is where they pass on all their knowledge and everything else, and usually you have to attain some type of growth procedure before you're indoctrinated into those things. We don't know if that occurs, but we do see similar habits. The large male just kind of wanting to get away from the family units and all go hang in the high mountains, usually in the most rugged areas. So grouping. They'll form family units, 7 plus minus subjects with female as lead, as the male's mostly absent. So we would think it's a matriarchal trip, like elephants. But when the alpha male, as with the bull elephant, decides to make a decision, that's the way it goes. So it very largely is a female-run family system. even raising the young males and things, with the large male, the alpha males not being present with the family unit, except periodically, especially during the birth of an infant. They'll form large subgroups of young to hunt, forage for the unit, often cause trouble. We've experienced subjects up to 8 or 10 in a single group. All of them seem to be the size around of what would be a teenager, and they seem to do kind of the same things teenagers do. Mess with people, mess with stuff, try to get a reaction, and then run like crazy, hooping and hollering like a bunch of monkeys. And it's just really funny when we compare that with modern human, because kids do the same thing. They go out at night, they cluster together, and they all get together and do things they're not supposed to do. They'll form smaller subgroups, 2 to 3 older subjects to hunt large game and raid. And in a minute we'll see some evidence of that, but we've also seen, where they'll have a male that knows enough to know what he's doing, and then they'll venture off kind of do things they know they shouldn't be doing away from the group because they have the ability. And that can be quite problemsome. This is where you normally end up with things like livestock being mutilated or whatever you might have that are generally being done by this age group of subject. Most often males move a few miles away alone when young but fully mature. We've kind of gone over that with the 17-inch subject. Once they kind of get older, it's like maybe the age of equivalent age of a human would do between the ages of 18, 22, 24. They go home, but they're not separated from home yet. They come home for mom to cook them a meal and such like that. We've seen similar activity with them where he's still a kid, he's still part of the group, but he just doesn't hang there anymore. Does his own thing, and moves in and out and still tries to care for the group. Large males often treat area's highest regulars together, we know that. Hopefully we haven't covered that. And that's going to take us to a new section. So a lot of the stuff we've shown previously, because there's no reason in changing that information. That information is the ecology of behavior, and that's always going to remain the same. But this is something we've added for this particular presentation. And I've titled it the dark side. And the reason for that is it is perceived as the dark side. We see animal mutilations, and in particular, in this case we're going to talk about, we see where animals are drained of blood. And we think, wow, vampires, vampiric things, all drained. It's such a negative aspect that we label it as a dark side to this enigma. We also find it amongst a bunch of other things that people don't know what's doing it, and it's a huge, huge problem, and it's a huge thing that everyone's been trying to answer. And we're going to show you in this case. Now, there's no children here. I hope anyone's not too squeamish. We do have some graphic pictures. We're going to start with the goat kills. This was a group of goats that were killed in one evening, and they were done so by something that entered into a fenced property with a big fence all around it and walls, got inside of a paddock. It took the goats outside of the paddock and killed each one of them and drained them of blood. Only one was a nasty kill, and that's this one actually. The way each one of them was killed was interesting because there was no teeth marks. In this case, you can actually see some of the process, but there's handprints literally on that side of that thing's face. And you can see where the hair has been rubbed off. It's like an Indian rug burn. They grab these things by head and neck and disable the animal without killing it. Because if you kill the animal, it's not going to release the blood. If you don't kill it and you do it that way, it'll pump all the blood. So this seems to be what they're doing, is disabling these animals. And in most cases, in all cases but one here, they laid down the animal quietly with almost no fight. But in one, by the younger subject who seemed to be less experienced in this, there was a great fight with this goat. And he ended up biting it in the brain to kill it. And I tried to get this skull, but the people who owned the property actually got rid of the animals in a place that would not tell me where they dumped them. But that skull had a hominin bite in top of the skull. But when it comes to getting the blood out of the animals, how do they do it? Right here we see where they actually punctured the femoral artery, which is down here. And they'll go for the carotid, which is up here. And so each of these goats had 2 punctures. One was at the carotid artery, one was at the femoral artery. Man, an animal will pump itself dry of blood in a heartbeat out these holes. There was no blood present on the ground whatsoever, and really none on the animals, but we had massive punctures into these arteries. Now we ask ourselves, well, let's get on this first. So how do we know what did this?
That was the paddock they were in?
Yes, so this is the paddock they were in. What we notice here is all the damage to this door is done on the top of the door. Something else that's interesting is this door doesn't really look any different than any other wired walls. Most animals would have no concept of where the door was. A bear would just tore through the wiring side, wouldn't have even hassled with it. These understood not only what a door is, but apparently that door should open. But of course it was locked. They pushed the top of the door so hard that, as you can see, it broke the framing of the top of the door. It literally pulled the screws out of the hinges of that door, and it broke the latch completely off, and we had to find the latch, which they did with so much force, the latch was like 15 feet from the door. So in one hit, apparently, they just demolished the door to go into the paddock like it was nothing. They also left hair at the top of the door frames, they were so big.
So that latch go into that hole? Is that how it closed?
Yeah, it went into that hole. One time now the latch isn't there at all anymore. And you can actually see where the hole is. See the split on the hole? So that latch split that 2x4 when it was knocked out too. So it wasn't an easy deal. I mean, and that's a lot of force, a tremendous amount of force. Now, how else do we know? Because as well, they're going to leave physical evidence. And in this case, it's trace evidence as in feet print. So we don't just know they did it, we know who did it. We know this is what on subject we call George, with a 14-inch to 15-inch footprint at this time. And we know that it was his little brother, which we call Amos. And we don't know what their names are. We give them names so we know which subjects we're talking about. You can say subject 324, but it's hard to remember all that. So we just say literally George or Amos. And in this case, it was after about a 5-day extreme weather event where nothing would have been out. And apparently they came to this land and property and did this. These are not the adults doing this, and we don't believe this would be behavior that would be accepted. Seems to me like, and would be, I've talked to biologists, would be a need, would be iron, or assault and iron after an event like that, where you've eaten 4 or 5 days of extreme cold with no food. And they just seem to have gone up to this property, done the deed, and left. It didn't take any goats with them, it caused no other problem. We don't believe this is something that would be actually acceptable in the family unit.
Didn't they take eggs also out of the chicken pen there?
Yeah, they did go into the chicken pen there. Didn't hurt any of the chickens, but they did remove eggs. They busted the side of the little coop open in there, pulled a couple eggs, dropped one. Yeah, they sure did. So, and you just hold your question and tell me to get through this if you don't mind, so we make sure we can get it all through. So that brings us to the dark side, or is it? Is what they're doing sinister? Is bloodletting, draining animals of blood? Does this have any negative connotation? We place the negative connotation, but often the evil is in the eyes of the beholder. Because as we see, this is something that's done around the world. This is the exact same process by the Messiah, what they do to their cattle. The only thing is they don't kill them. They clot the wound before the animals lose too much blood. But what they're doing is exactly the same. They're muzzling the animal by the head and neck, controlling the animal, and using a sharp point to pierce the carotid artery, and which will then drain blood out, and they use that to make different diet or make different dishes and things that they would consume. It's part of their life. So why would we put the evil connotation of the dark side over a creature out there doing literally exactly the same thing when we accept this as a practice by native peoples all around the world? So is it a dark side? I think not. Now, the scientific view. This is unique. And I want everyone to kind of place this in their minds by what they've been told Bigfoot is for the last 40 years. Basically, it's always been perpetuated as a big ape or a big monkey. And we've also been told that science doesn't accept this. We've been told that science sees these things as a myth, sees them as something that couldn't be real. I'm going to tell you that's not the view science has. This is called man versus ape, modern view curriculum and classification, because we get this straight from the modern curriculum used today in school. If you go for anthropology or whatever, this is going to be what you read. Our source is Through the Lens of Anthropology, 2nd edition, 2019. Introduction to Human Evolution and Culture, which is interesting, Human Evolution and Culture. Chapter 2, page 50, and it reads, believers should be aware that if they do sight a Bigfoot, they should probably leave it alone. It probably isn't a large human-like ape. If it exists, it's probably a human who wants to be left alone, and nobody should do it harm. Recall that if a primate is bipedal, as Bigfoot is typically reported to be, it is classified as human. And take a real careful look at that statement. It probably isn't a large human-like ape. If a primate is bipedal, it is classified as human. Now, why for 45 years has the main PhD in this field been telling you that it's suspected to be Gigantopithecus, the big ape from Asia who crossed the land bridge, at the same time telling you that this is a bipedal primate, when every biologist, anatomist, anthropologist knows that if it's a bipedal primate, it's a human? Where does this come from? Why has a pro been telling you for 45 years this is likely to be a giant ape when he knows for a fact that it's not? He knows for a fact that it's a human. Why did that occur? And I want to tell you, we've been presenting this fact for about 3 years now, and now the narrative has changed. After 45 years, we were able to push it off and push it over, and now that same person says ancient human. He's gone from Gigantopithecus to Australopithecus. Ancient monkey, ancient human. We call that one a win. Trust the science. Oh, the real dark side, right? And we've been taught to trust the science. Which I do. I have great respect for academics. I have great respect for science and everything they've ever done. But being on the, not just the witness end of this, but on the full-blown research end of this, we've seen what happens. We've seen why you don't know what they know. And I've just shown you. Is the scientific opinion that these things are a myth? No, they're telling you it's probably a large human. Period. That's the scientific view. Here we go. There's hope. Science is going to take this serious. So Oxford University did a study, and as many of you might remember, that they were going to test Yeti and Bigfoot DNA for the first time. It was going to be the Oxford-Lausanne Collateral Hominid Project, an effort between Oxford University and the Museum of Lausanne, Switzerland, Museum of Zoology, get together, and they were going to see what the heck's out there. So they were asking for samples. They came to us and requested that we do some type of field study and get them DNA samples. We took it on. We already had one in file, so we sent it to them. It came back as unknown. There's the first thing you never heard about through the Associated Press, that they found anything that was considered unknown. Matter of fact, on the conclusion of the study, which they held the study for another 2 months, because our first specimen had no recoverable DNA. The hair was right, but they couldn't recover DNA. So they literally held the whole world. 2 months went by. Everybody waited for the results of this thing. And what their question to us was, can you get a specimen off a living creature? They wouldn't have asked us that if that first sample wasn't something. So we did. It took 2 months. But in the presence of a U.S. Forest Service veteran, an archaeologist, and 4 or 5 other witnesses, and finding the 16-inch prints I've shown you, the 22-inch print on our table, and 170 other feet print, and finding yucca fruit with bite imprint with missing teeth, all these things accompanied the recovery of this hair, which was done with the utmost amount of care. Its transference was done in a hermetically sealed positive pressure chamber cabinet, camera inside the cabinet, camera outside the cabinet, absolutely untouchable. Its trace of custody was beyond reproach. There'd be no contamination. Everything was witnessed, everything was above board. So we submitted all of this to the study. What was the conclusion of that study? So much for the abominable snowman. Study finds the Yeti DNA belongs to bears. Okay, now we know this isn't the truth. For one, we've already had one that's sent back unknown. And what we were told at the end of this thing was the hair, the second one that they held the whole study for 2 months, mind you, was now being curated in the Museum of Zoology, Lausanne, Switzerland, for future study. That's bull. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. Because, for one, any second-year biologist student can easily go get a manual and differentiate any bear, possum, dog, whatever hair from a primate hair instantaneously. You'd never even test the DNA on a bear hair. Why would you? It's bear. You can tell by the morphology of the hair itself it's bear. So why would you conduct DNA tests? They didn't. They lied to the public. They said that the DNA came back a mix between a type of a brown bear and a polar bear, some ancient species, blah, blah, blah. This must be the Yeti. Man, it's a real study. They never would have tested that stuff, and they didn't. All that was hyperbole. And the fact is, we can prove it with this specimen right here. That is the actual, if you guys want to take a picture or whatever, that is the actual sample submission number of that hair they waited for 2 months. Now it's being curated for future study, but yet they told the AP that every sample was tested and the results released. And I can tell you, they didn't release either our first specimen or our second specimen because this was never entered into the study, even though they held it for 2 months. And I say to you, because Brian Sykes has now passed away, but where did it go? There's the sample submission number. This has trace of custody. That sample exists, and it can be considered a smoking gun. After all that fiasco, we were contacted by the University of Mexico Gallup. They wanted to take a serious look into this because they're on the Navajo res, and those people do take a serious note to it. They attribute part of the survival of their people and culture to the Bigfoot. During the long walk, when most of the Navajo were marched away from their homelands, they had to leave the elderly and the children behind. And when they returned from the long walk many years later, they found those people alive in the Chuska Mountains. And they asked them, how in the world did you survive? And they were told, we were brought up here and taken care of by the hairy man. So to the Navajo, these are the saviors of their culture because the elders held their memories and held their teachings. That would have gone away had it not been for the hairy man that kept them and kept them alive. So we did this. First off, we did a year-long field study as instructed. And then, when it came time to produce the results, 2 things happened. One was we had handed the DNA off, all the evidence, to Dr. Meldrum. And with instruction to get it to 3 domestic laboratories, do not send it overseas. This is because what I just dealt with. I just dealt with Oxford. And we just saw what just happened with them. So we absolutely instructed them, do not send them overseas. 3 domestic labs. So during the year field study, we waited for results. Well, he never answered the phone. He never contacted. We never found out where was the trace of custody, the sample submission numbers to our DNA evidence. We couldn't get a response until we put on this event. Now, this event was formally proposed to notify and inform the faculty, other scientists and other teachers and things like that of the results of the field study. As well, we opened the doors to the university. They had the largest turnout at the university in the university's history, not only by a small factor, by over twice the populace they've ever had show up for anything. These were the local Navajo, because this is a part of their life, and they had a great interest to see how this was being studied and portrayed by their college. So we did this, and when we refrain to these things, we terminate, they're young and offspring. We don't call them their offspring, we call them their children. And it's interesting because the famous doctor in this got offended by that. He didn't like the fact that we were regarding these things as human. This is something that apparently, for some reason or another, it was almost taboo. But you see here, his name's on here. We were bringing him in as part of this. But the reason we did that was because we hadn't heard from him in a year. Now, he showed up to this event, and he did his normal presentation on Gigantopithecus. And then came the time at the table afterwards to ask, where's the DNA? Where is everything that was submitted? Where's all the materials we handed you? While eating, in between bites, he just told me, I don't know. And he took another bite. And what the world? This is a deal. It's a full year we got into this deal. The executive director sitting there asking him, and I don't know is not going to suffice. I couldn't take it. I literally said, what do you mean you don't know? Where's the trace of custody? Where did it go? Did you throw it in the trash? What happened to it? You know what he told me? I gave it to Brian Sykes. What? Brian Sykes is Oxford. Brian Sykes is the one that just screwed us. Brian Sykes is the one you were told. Only told one name not to give it to was Brian Sykes. But that's who he gave all the evidence to. Then you gotta wonder, this is a PhD. He understands trace of custody. He understands how these things are supposed to work. Why in the world we have done that? Now we have no data. We have no DNA. There's no sample submission numbers. There's no trace of custody whatsoever. There's no pro in the world that could do that on accident. It'd be impossible. So what do we see? A cover-up, a new deception. New Mexico University official under fire for Bigfoot hunt. Now they were accusing the executive director of fraud. They said he spent taxpayer money. That's a big charge. That's not a little thing to be an executive director of a university and be accused of fraud. That's some pretty serious criminal charges. Their basis was there was no evidence from the study. So thanks to Meldrum tossing the stuff in the trash at Brian Sykes' hands, there's no evidence now to defend the executive director of a university, not a community college. This got to be pretty serious. They did a 22-minute special investigation by a network news, declaring just how bad all of us were for doing this. They removed us out of the segment because I threatened the literal piss out of them, legally and illegally both. But they didn't remove our face, they didn't remove the executive director, and they didn't remove some of the people around the team. They destroyed their lives. This didn't stop. It continued. New York Post, university blew taxpayer dollars on search for Bigfoot. Here goes the propaganda. You notice the study didn't make the New York Post. None of the work we did made the New York Post. But the first little inference of a fraud, and somehow or another they get the news. And in the end sum, a state senator proposed law to ban the study of what they called a mythical creature. Mythical because why? We had no DNA evidence. There was nothing physical after a year supposed. This was their entire basis for going after the executive director. What we did in response to this was a presentation to a scientific peer group, the same scientists that were going to be used against the executive director in court. And we invited it. Like we said, get us into court, we dare you. Because that would give us an opportunity to present the DNA evidence that was not thrown away. If Meldrum thought we were going to give him everything, is he crazy? Right? So what did we do? We walked in and laid all that evidence on the same table as these skeptical scientists. And these aren't just jokes. The NMSR is New Mexicans for Scientific Reasoning. It is made up of retired and active scientists from Los Alamos National Laboratories, Sandia National Laboratories, and the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque campus. Now, these are big pros. They shoot down everybody. That's what they do. They invite you in, they tear your science apart, and they make a stock at you, basically. They didn't do that. We presented for 3.5 hours, after which, crickets. Not a single word of doubt came out of that crowd. And these are all intellectuals. They're people who are used to just bashing others. And what was most interesting, the guy they had on the news special, who was in charge of New Mexicans for Scientific Reasoning, himself got on the mic when we were done and wanted to know and asked everyone, did we miss it? Could we have missed it? We turned him 3.5 hours, biggest skeptic in the planet, we turned him. To the point to where he wanted to go out with us. He wanted to get on the mountain with our teams, not just be down there doing this dictation anymore. What happened with the court case? Off in the wind, gone away. We proved our point to their very skeptics. How could they walk into a court now and testify, no way this thing exists, when we just changed their mind? They'd have to lie. They'd have to walk into that courtroom and say, yeah, well, maybe, because he damn sure laid shit out on the table. We better take a look. That would have been it. Charge is done. Not only that, we would have had our opportunity to present physical proof for Bigfoot in a court of law. Do you think they wanted to go for that? We could have just proved it. Boom, you guys want to nail it? Let's go. We were ready. We're down. It didn't happen. Because what would we have just done when we did that? We would have ended this question. And that leads us to the DNA. We don't have sample submission numbers, do we? We have nothing for this thing, do we? But all that still existed. And the question still remains. And this is not a personal or political jab. To this person, the question still remains, even to this day. Where did they go, Mr. Meldrum? Now we're going to close this. We're going to close it with a quote by Albert Einstein. The fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and science. Thank you, and keep watching. Yeah, I'll take any questions you guys have at this point.
the transient, why does he go off? Is he being rejected by the rest of the family?
No, it's just like common behavior even amongst,
Kids.
well, that's portion. Who knows? How about, hey, Billy, you gotta take care of Johnny for the next 2 hours. Johnny doesn't wanna do this anymore. I'm tired of this, Mom, I'm out of here. Basically, as we grow up and grow older, that's what we do. And it causes us to expand and blend in our genetic diversity. And so it's common behavior as animals. It doesn't matter if it's a dog or puppy. When kittens and things are born, they have a natural barrier of distance from their den or from their pack. As you'll notice, as the weeks go on, that barrier gets farther and farther out. That doesn't stop in the mature phases. Up into the adulthood, what does we do? We move, we go. People just do this inherently, and so do many of the animals. It's just how they move around and how they blend their genetic diversity.
Yes, I was wondering, when they drain the blood, what did they do with it? They cut one at a time and drink it?
So when they drain the blood, what they do with it is, yeah, they're drinking it. These are big juice bags. We've seen them actually do it to dogs, to all kinds of things. And sometimes they'll use a tool, and sometimes they won't. And literally, I mean, there's pit bull, broad daylight, was literally drained within minutes and thrown right back in the driveway one day at a woman's house.
How
The
big?
question, why does the scientific community care if there's a Bigfoot or not? I mean,
Well, there's
why
an
do
awful,
they care?
there's a lot of reasons. So early on, socioeconomic, religious, and other kinds of things. So there's been a lot of perpetuation on where the human came from, what the human history is and all this. And they really don't need anything that muddies those waters and makes you ask a question. The other thing is professional accountability. How am I an academic institution? How am I a government bureau? How am I anybody else, the Department of Interior, Natural Resources, U.S. Forest Service, whoever who's been out there this entire time, and I'm gonna tell you, no, these things don't exist, right? But we know they do, we have the proof they do. What are they gonna say? Are they gonna say, I was lying to you this whole time, okay? Are we good? Forgive me, we just lied. Or are they gonna say, I was too incompetent, too stupid to have known it was out there? No, they're not gonna do either one of those things. Where does that leave them today? It leaves them in a conundrum. They don't know what to do with you. So the only way you can do it, it's like we do, is offer them, in a sense, amnesty and say that you guys aren't the ones that hid this. You may be perpetuating it, but we don't blame you for doing that. You were indoctrinated into a system of that. But generally, it's literally because accountability. How many of tens of thousands of people have vanished in the forest? How many forests did they left open while they knew this activity was happening? How many people did they let go into zones where they knew this activity, the potential for it was, and then who has the liability, the accountability for all that to have happened? We see a great, great teardown in our authority and in the academic institutions. They would lose so much faith in these things collectively. I'm going to tell you another one, human rights. That's why they don't want you to know these things are human. You think you have rights every day. And the things we do, we walk around and everything else, and we think, man, we're free. We can do whatever we want. We make decisions for ourselves. Anybody can become Elon Musk overnight. Boy, this is the land of freedom and happiness, right? Often a bound man doesn't realize he's bound till he sees a free man. Just because you have everything within your fence doesn't mean you have everything. You have everything within your fence. Are you free? Because you have everything you need, everything you want to do, are you free? No. What if you don't want to do any of that? Bigfoot represents a human who's been granted human rights. He doesn't have fences, he doesn't have laws, he doesn't have policy, he doesn't have politics, he can hunt anywhere he wants, he can live anywhere he wants, he can do anything he wants. What if the term comes today to say, yeah, okay, it's a relic human. What are human rights? Obviously, they're not going to go try to put him on a res. That's never going to happen. It represents something that we all should have. The fundamental rights, just by being alive, granted to us, actually guaranteed to us for our own Constitution. They represent the rights we have been relieved of. They've taken from us and convinced us that we are free. They represent freedom. If they have the right as a human to run around and do anything they want in our forests, to do whatever they're doing, to live anywhere they want, don't we? That's the reason. Okay, we had a question right here, and I'll get to over there in a second. Okay, in the back.
So in all your time studying, how many times have you personally observed and seen Bigfoot? And I'll couple that with, they seem to have some special ability not to be seen. But, so, have you observed the special ability they use not to be seen? Am I wrong in that premise? Or?
No, you're not wrong whatsoever. And it may be a surprising answer to you. I've seen them many, many, many times. Fleeting glimpses, full blown on, as close as this man is to me, both in the day and night. Scariest things you'll ever. The deal with the seeing them and their special abilities. Okay, so, and I'll try to touch on this kind of quick. So we have found where tracks of Bigfoot in a snowy field, nowhere to go, have vanished. And we instantly attribute that to them walking into another world. The natives say they walk in two worlds. But to the natives, there was, and myself included, there was only two worlds. There's the physical world and there's the spiritual world. They're not saying another physical world on the other side of a portal. There's the physical and there's the spiritual. So when you walk in two worlds, you're walking in the physical or you're walking in the spiritual. Now, people astral travel and remote view. What are they doing? They're walking in two worlds. So I'm just to fill this in. So there's two aspects to cover here. One is the human aspect of our own intellect and our interpretation of what we see, or how our brain filters information that we receive. The other is, what are the capabilities? What are we witnessing? And how do those two things factor together? Often orbs, for example, are seen in association with Bigfoot. But we know through scientific standard that any form of energy that's not being affected by an outside source forms a sphere. It's natural for even a human intellect to be represented or manifest as a sphere. We can often then assume that if they walk in two worlds, and one would be the spiritual, one would be the physical, and the manifestation of walking in the spiritual world could be a glowing sphere, then what are we witnessing with those Bigfoot? My conclusion from that would be, if I was to form an actual conclusion, would be that when a subject comes there to go check out a group of campers or whatever it may be happening, and there's orbs there, that's probably just the family unit astral traveling to the event. Oftentimes we see just orbs. That's probably the same thing. That's probably an astral travel event to that location to witness and see what's going on, and then return without physically being in that place. It doesn't have to be anything that extreme or that extravagant. We know these things occur. They've been scientifically tested amongst modern humans. Well, we have one trigger that prevents most of this stuff from us doing it, and that is ego. And I'm going to tell you right now, that's something they don't have. They have fear. They have everything else we have. They don't possess ego. They don't possess what should I be? How should I be? What should I do? What is okay for me to do? What's acceptable? Or what are my abilities and what are they limited by? They don't recognize any of that. They do what they naturally do. And I believe all of us would have that power if we didn't have that trigger. On the other end, when we talk about the portals, the vanishing, and the aspect like that. Now, often, as I said before, we've been able to continue tracking them where witnesses have literally said they vanished before their eyes. But there's something very unique about that, because it vanished before your eyes. Or did it vanish between your eyes and your brain? See, oftentimes when we see something that the brain cannot equate, it cannot associate to anything else, it is the definition of the word recondite. That means you don't have anything to compare it to in your database. When this happens in the mind automatically brackets these things. What we're looking at is not through a glass tube onto a screen. We are looking through just like an interface of a camera that has an AI filter. So it builds the image of what we're looking for at all times. This is where hallucinations come from. This is where different witness accounts of the same episode will come from. I have been around looking at something, standing next to a man that could not see it. Why couldn't he see it? I can see it. But why couldn't the natives in South America see the Spanish galleons when they pulled in and anchored? They couldn't see the boats. Because their mind had no way to put a boat into that situation. They literally could not see them. And they recorded it took hours before they could. That's what the mind does. Anything that is too scary, too out of the limit of comprehension, we can't factor it, we cannot associate it, gets changed by the brain. And it's to protect you. Because trust me, just knowing these things are out there, put people into shock. Thinking it's out there, yeah, that's cool. Suspecting, that's cool. Seeing a fleeting glimpse at a distance, that's cool. But what shuts down people when they see one at 200 feet? What changes every day of the rest of their entire life, where nothing makes any sense anymore? It's not good enough. And everyone that's ever had a good encounter suffers from the same thing. That's that right there in the mind. Only some brains can take that in as what it is, and it's not.